is going to introduce our speaker, but I wanted to start by thanking all of you for coming. I remind you that there's a reception afterward, so hope you stick around. And wanted to also thank the Jack Miller Center for funding this lecture series. Our next public talk will be February 16th. It'll be Ross Dapic from the New York Times. So hope you'll all come to that. All right. So I wanted to introduce you to Chloe Barrett, who's a sophomore studying psychology and French. She's a constitutional fellow and Gregg fellow, and she originally hails from Phoenix, Arizona, same place as Arizona State, where our speaker is coming from, sort of.
Okay, Michael Zuckert is the Nancy R. Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He is also now a clinical professor at Arizona State University. He has written and taught extensively in political theory, American political thought, and constitutional studies. He has just published a book called A Nation So Conceived, Abraham Lincoln and the Paradox of Democratic Sovereignty. His other books include Natural Rights and the New Republicanism, The Natural Rights Republic, Launching Liberalism, and with Catherine Zuckert, The Truth About Leo Strauss and the Problem of Political Philosophy, in addition to many articles. He also edited The Spirit of Religion and The Spirit of Liberty, and with Derek Webb, the anti-federal writings of the Melanchthon Smith Circle. So please welcome Mr. Zuckert.
Thank you, Chloe. Yeah, it's actually here. Good. Thank you. Okay, well, I greet you all, and pleased to see such a huge crowd here. I'm pleased to be here in Kansas, not a place I've ever spent much time, but it figures a fair amount in my talk, so it's a good place to come to do this talk. Now, Lincoln, as you may know, or maybe don't know, is regularly voted by the experts in presidency studies to be the greatest president in American history. Despite that fact, however, he has actually come in for much criticism early and late, in fact, in his time and Harvard. In fact, I've identified there have been two main waves of criticism of Lincoln in the 20th century and hailing into the 21st century. The first was sponsored by some of the great historians of the Civil War of the early part of this 20th century. They came to reconsider Lincoln's statecraft, especially as he practiced it in the pre-Civil War period. Their criticism of Lincoln goes something like this. He took an overly radical and moralistic position, they say, in the pre-war period, and together with the abolitionists and some of his Republican Party allies, he transformed a conflict that had been compromised and settled in a peaceful way over time, transformed it into a situation that was no longer settlable and indeed had all the marks of a great tragedy. The Civil War, according to these folks, was not inevitable in any way in itself, but Lincoln and his friends made it so by their intransigence. Lincoln famously had said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Now, so these historians believe that Lincoln, by pronouncing and acting on the principles of this house divided speech, created a situation and a climate of opinion in which the South could do nothing but see his election as a declaration of war against them and their institutions, and thus give them no choice but to leave the Union. At the same time, Lincoln insisted, as he said, that he did not expect the Union to be dissolved, that he did not expect the House to fall, but he did expect it will cease to be divided. Now, what Lincoln stated here, this is again from the House Divided speech, what he stated here as a mere prediction was in fact for him an imperative of policy. And he was resolved not to allow the dissolution of the Union. So now the unstoppable force of Lincoln-inspired Southern fear met the immovable object of Lincolnian resolve to maintain the Union. And once the issue was formulated this way, war was inevitable. As Lincoln said in his second inaugural, and the war came. This line of argument about the Civil War and Lincoln became powerful during the first half of the 20th century, as I suggested, and it was associated at the time with a national reassessment of the end result of the Civil War. Just to remind you of some facts at that time, the segregation system had replaced slavery in the South, and Northern opinion had lost all zeal that it had formerly had for civil rights and for remaking Southern society, or for attending to sexually divisive issues in general, because they were the country was immersed in what was an explosive economic expansion at that time. Reading backwards from the accommodation at that time to the peculiar racial patterns in the South, Americans began to wonder whether the Civil War, up until World War II, the most destructive war in human history, whether the Civil War had been worth it. Many historians, breathing in the spirit of their age then, redefined the war as preventable, with Lincoln and the abolitionists as the chief villains in snatching war from the jaws of peace. Now, the historians varied a good deal in the motivations that they attributed to Lincoln. Some thought it was just an example of poor judgment, that he didn't understand what kind of war it would actually be, for example. So at the outbreak of fighting, he called for, 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. A small, quick war is what he seemed to have been anticipating. To put these numbers in some sort of perspective, however, recall that the Civil War left nearly 620,000 dead people on both sides before it was over 4 years later. Others see the entire episode even less favorably than they thought. One very famous essay called Abraham Lincoln and the Self-Made Myth attributed all of Lincoln's actions to nothing other than overweening personal ambition, that Lincoln was willing to risk all, to risk the future of his country and the lives of his countrymen so that he might hold high office. Now, ironically, the charges I've just mentioned to you from the first part of the 20th century are more or less the opposite of the charges raised against Lincoln in the later part of the 20th century and today. Not his intransigence, but his half-heartedness, the narrowness of his motives, of his actions, and of his views, his deep conservatism in all that he did and thought. These are the new targets. This line of thought about Lincoln emerged in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. Lincoln, these critics insist, may have signed the document that freed the slaves, but he didn't much like black people, did not want to free slaves, favored the interests of whites only, and did not see America as a place for blacks and whites to live together in harmony. In the final analysis, these charges amounted to the Dred accusations: racism, conservatism. He revered the works of the fathers, for example, and pro-capitalism. He frequently spoke of the virtues of free markets. Now, these two sets of charges together are very serious. On the one hand, Lincoln is held to be drastically deficient in statecraft, that is, deficient politically. In the other, he's said to be deficient morally. Now, what I want to do this afternoon, early evening, is to think a little bit about Lincoln, about these charges, partly to defend him, and partly merely to ruminate over Lincoln and some of the issues raised by his career. I want to deal with these charges against him in a certain form, though, in terms of the question, was Lincoln right, or was Stephen Douglas right in their great debates? These debates concerned a very simple question. What should national policy be with respect to the presence or absence of slavery in the territories belonging to the United States. Territories that were not states yet, but were just unorganized territories. The territories in question were largely that part of the country then called Kansas, Nebraska. That is where we happen right now, by some strange coincidence to be. Lincoln and Douglas were running against each other for the privilege of serving as senator from the state of Illinois. Here was an election campaign in which the candidates treated the half-educated electorate, who turned out in droves, even more than here, and sat for 3 hours at least, sometimes more, as intelligent, informed, or at least capable of being informed, and capable of judging for themselves about the important issues facing them as citizens. I'm not going to pause to make the obvious comparison to electioneering candidates and the electorate in our time. Now, in these debates, each stood for one policy. Douglas for the policy of territorial self-determination, or what he liked to call popular sovereignty. Lincoln stood for the prohibition of slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska territories, at least those north of the old Missouri Compromise line. Douglas's policy of popular sovereignty was actually a brilliant solution to an intractable problem of politics, both high and low. His policy itself was actually very simple. Instead of Congress deciding whether slavery would or would not be allowed to exist in the territories, as had been the policy existing in America since 1787 in the Northwest Ordinance, Douglas proposed instead of that the people of each territory be allowed to settle this question for themselves. The issue was especially important, for if slavery was once planted in a territory, it was almost inevitable that that territory would come into the Union as a state with slavery or without, depending on how it had been settled in its pre-state condition. Given the way representation in the Senate works and the role of senatorial representation in the Electoral College, the relative number of free and slave states was a matter of importance to all sections of the country. That is, wasn't actually as localized as Douglas wanted it to be. Therefore, the strongest political passions were brought to bear on Congress in the attempt to deal with the territories. All of national politics was caught up in the sectional conflict, and that proved to be very explosive. Douglas's solution actually was elegant. We have to recognize that. The principle of America, he said, is self-government. Therefore, let the people of each territory govern themselves. Let them decide for themselves. Why should Washington dictate a solution? Douglas thought he had found a way to settle what appeared to be a Union-threatening conflict. The center of conflict would no longer be Washington, but would be the local territories. It was a masterful effort to deflect and disarm conflict. It was an effort to avoid what was becoming the most contentious element of this conflict, which was this. For Congress to make a pronouncement on the subject amounted to a national endorsement of the principles and institutions of one or the other section and implicitly a rejection of the other. Since Congress had forbidden slavery in the past, the Southerners felt as though their special institutions and values were disvalued by the nation. The South felt slighted and demanded that its institutions be recognized as equally valued. Now, Douglas's popular sovereignty policy gave the South at least some of what it wanted here. If not national endorsement of slavery, then at least a cessation of the implicit national condemnation of slavery. So under Douglas's popular sovereignty policy, the federal government is to remain strictly neutral. It's strictly neutral between northern principles of freedom and southern principles of slavery. Douglas frequently said when he was out campaigning, he said he didn't care whether slavery was voted up or down, just that it be voted. But Douglas was not so personally neutral as these public statements implied. He did not particularly wish to see slavery spread, or at least so we all believe, and he thought that his policy would not in fact lead to that result. He believed that slavery took root or not because of laws, but because of physical conditions. Some climates and resulting agricultural systems are suited to slavery, and other climates are not. Nature, not law, would decide where slavery would go, and thus the divisive political battles could be avoided in a way that made no difference to the ultimate. That was Douglas's viewpoint. Douglas's position, as you can see, was a statesmanly position. It aimed to promote political peace and harmony, and to avoid both the scylla of disunion and the corridors of civil war. No wonder some historians came to condemn Lincoln for intransigently framing the issue in such a way as to prevent Douglas's specific and apparently humane policy from succeeding, and thus forcing the nation to first face one thing, secession, and then the other, civil war. So now it must be said at the outset that Lincoln did everything in his power, to prevent the country from adopting Douglas's policy. He had mostly dropped out of politics in 1850 after he had served one term in Congress. That was his only federal political service before being president. He had turned his attention, this time more seriously, to his legal practice than ever before, and he seemed resolved to make his life mostly outside politics. His plans changed in 1854, however, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which had made Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine the new law of the land, in place of the Missouri Compromise. This act very explicitly repealed the Missouri Compromise. Lincoln's change of direction was remarkable. He turned back to politics with only one object, which was to show the perniciousness of the Douglas policy and the corresponding, as he said, propriety of the restoration of the Missouri Compromise, or even the extension of it by prohibiting slavery in the territories together. Lincoln insisted that the question of substantive principle, the question of whether slavery was right or wrong, could not be pushed aside in favor of the purely procedural solution of Douglas's popular sovereignty. Now, this may seem to be the obviously right answer, but I don't think we can rest quite so easily with it. Conceding that Lincoln is correct about the moral evil of slavery, it is still a fact that he was not about to change the minds of the slaveholders or their allies. Moreover, he was far from an abolitionist himself. He conceded that despite the moral wrong of slavery, only the states where it existed had any power or right under the Constitution to do anything about it. And he knew that they were not about to abolish slavery in any time soon. It is not at all clear then that any good could follow from Lincoln's policy, but it certainly was clear to Douglas that much political evil could follow, an intensified return to all of the conflict characteristic of the country before 1554. One could say that Lincoln's policy was irresponsible. Now, in 1854, Lincoln explained lucidly, I should say, why he left his lucrative law, well, pretty lucrative, he never really made a lot of money, but somewhat lucrative law practice, and took it upon himself to speak out against Douglas, who was the leading politician in Illinois and one of the leading politicians in the country. It was because, he tells us, quote now, "I hate this declared indifference to the spread of slavery." Hatred, a pretty strong sentiment from somebody who, after the Civil War, when hatred was quite widespread, called for malice toward none and charity for all. Lincoln hated the policy of indifference to slavery and came out of semi-retirement to voice that hatred and to try to make others feel it also. Here's what he said about it. I hate it, he said this in 1854, because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world. And especially I hate it because it forces so many good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principle of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting there is no right principle of action but self-interest. So Lincoln hates Douglas's approach for its effect on three different groups. First, on the enslaved themselves as victims of the monstrous injustice of slavery. Second, on those foreigners who are enemies to America and to republicanism, and who are heartened by the existence of slavery in the midst of freedom. This proves to them the hypocrisy of the Americans. It's a well-known statement. Samuel Johnson, a great dictionary maker, Samuel Johnson said at the time of the American Revolution, he said, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" Finally, Lincoln hates the effect on many good men amongst ourselves. It leads them into opposition to the Declaration of Independence and the principles of political rights. Perhaps surprisingly, Lincoln identified this last as his special ground for hating Douglas's position. Well, he was definitely onto something when he saw slavery as turning many men against the Declaration of Independence. Senator John Pettit of Indiana, my former senator before I moved out of the great state of Indiana, he said in 1854 on the very floor of the Senate, he called the Declaration of Independence a self-evident lie. From Lincoln's point of view, perhaps the most discouraging sign of the war that slavery provoked against the Declaration was a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in the infamous Dred Scott case. There, the Chief Justice of the United States said that the Declaration of Independence could not possibly have been meant to apply to members of the African race who, he concluded, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This is the fulfillment to a T of what Lincoln declared. In 1854, that good men, he feared in 1854, that good men would reject the very principles of political right and instead insist there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Now, all three of Lincoln's points end up being variants of the first point. Douglas's policy ignores the monstrous injustice of slavery. It is this injustice that robs American institutions of their power of example and that threatens to rob America of its own commitment to right principles of action. Lincoln's point here is a bit more subtle than it seems, however. It is not slavery itself that does these bad things so much as the Douglas approach to slavery, that is, the declaration of official indifference to its rightness or wrongness. Lincoln thought slavery a monstrous injustice, but he thought it would have to be lived with for the time being, and that it could be, so long as the proposition on the spread of slavery remained in the law, served two crucial purposes. First, to affirm the inherent wrong of slavery by not being neutral about it, and second, to, as he put it, to give the public mind reason to believe that slavery was in course of ultimate extinction. Now, in the second wave of criticism after the start of the Civil Rights Movement, Lincoln was blamed for being so tolerant of slavery as this, blamed for opposing and not the evil itself, but the peripheral matter of the spread of the evil, all the while affirming his willingness to tolerate evil where it existed. Lincoln apparently hated Douglas's stated indifference about slavery even more than he hated the evil of slavery. Now, we can understand his reasons for opposing Douglas's effort at statesmanly settlement, as well as his reasons for not going further in an abolitionist direction, only by listening to what he says about the monstrous injustice of slavery. So, his central argument against slavery is a very simple syllogism. Premise one: all human beings are equal, or otherwise stated, possess equal rights, or, as he sometimes put it, possess rights to themselves. Premise two: the blacks are human beings. Conclusion: therefore, slavery of the blacks or any human being is unjust because it is a denial of rights, the denial of the rights of self-ownership belonging to himself. Lincoln, as you can see, was no relativist. He did not believe that it was merely his value judgment that slavery was wrong. Rather, he insisted it is wrong, and a decent political society needs to recognize that. But he also knew that not everyone accepted this syllogism. In particular, the first premise had become very controversial in his time. So then, what is Lincoln's argument in favor of his first premise that all men are equal? Actually, he made three chief arguments for universal human equality and against slavery. Three arguments. His first, and probably most common argument, was an argument from feeling. He told his audience in 1854, "Your sense of justice and human sympathy continually tell you that the poor Negro has some natural right to himself." Later he says, "Repeal the Missouri Compromise, repeal all compromises, repeal the Declaration of Independence, repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. It still will be the abundance of man's heart that slavery is wrong." It is certain, Lincoln asserts, that the great mass of mankind consider slavery a great moral wrong. And their feeling against it is not evanescent, but eternal. It lies at the very foundation of their sense of justice. So, nature, as expressed in the universal or near universal promptings of the human heart, teaches that human beings are equal and that slavery is a terrible wrong. But nature is not the only source of this knowledge for me. My ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. By his ancient faith, Lincoln means, of course, the Declaration of Independence, a statement not universally known and delivered by the human heart in the natural feelings, but rather a proposition put forward in an especially specifically American document. It is Lincoln's, or our faith, not the faith of mankind in general. Where Lincoln's first argument appeals to universal nature, his second appeals to history, to a particular deliverance of our history. These two arguments, perhaps not contradictory to each other, still, they're nevertheless quite different. To these two arguments, Lincoln adds a third, very different from the others. Where the others are in one form or another non-rational arguments, feeling or faith, this is a rational argument. And I'm going to quote now some. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is colored then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin in the room. Oh, you do not mean color exactly. You mean the whites are intellectually the superiors of the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, You are to be a slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. Now, this is, in a way, a very simple argument. Yet it's also, I think, a very powerful argument. It's what's known in some circles, if you want the fancy, a dialectically necessary argument. It depends on a claim that I, each and every I, raise for myself. I feel, I know in my bones, my own claim to freedom, that I am free and want to be free. I cannot help but see this and assert this claim for myself. And Lincoln's reasoning makes me see that I cannot go on to affirm the enslaving of another without endangering in principle my own freedom. To affirm slavery for others is to affirm slavery for oneself. As Lincoln said in another place, though volume upon volume is written to prove slavery a very good thing, we never hear of the man who wishes to take the good of it by being a slave himself. Or even more simply, he said, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. As you may have noticed, this last argument also contains an important premise rooted in feeling. And it is in this respect a bit like Lincoln's first argument about feeling. But there's an important difference. In the first argument, the so-called universal feeling is a direct revulsion against slavery of others. In this third argument, it's a direct revulsion against slavery of oneself. Lincoln, I think, is on much solider ground and knows that he is in affirming the universality of that latter feeling than of the former. After all, as he concedes, volumes and volumes have been written to justify the slavery of others, but no one willingly chooses this state for himself. In a word, Lincoln's third or rational argument is much better as an argument. As a matter of logic, as a matter of clear thinking, Lincoln proves that one can accept slavery for any person only on pain of self-contradiction. Yet, Lincoln knows that human beings do not consider the pain of self-contradiction the worst pain that they might suffer. He once sat down to consider the case of the Reverend Dr. Ross of Alabama, a slaveholder, conscientious man of God, who came to ask himself the question whether his slave should be a slave. Dr. Ross received no direct and unambiguous answer from the Bible, and certainly he never bothers to ask his slave his opinion. So now Lincoln says, so at last it comes to this, that Dr. Ross is to decide the question, and while he considers it, he sits in the shade with gloves on his hands and subsists on the bread his slaves are earning in the burning sun. If he decides that God wills these slaves free, he thereby has to walk out of the shade, throw off his gloves, and delve for his own bread. Will Dr. Ross be actuated by that perfect impartiality which has ever been considered most favorable to correct decisions? So the Reverend Ross is more willing to suffer the pain of contradiction than the pain of hard labor in the hot sun. Only if human beings generally found the pain of self-contradiction less tolerable than other pains would rational argument be as conclusive in practice as it is in theory. What makes a proposition true and what makes a proposition effective as a maxim of action are in fact quite different things. This is the single most important truth about politics. This disparity sets the task for statesmanship to make the true and good and right also be effective, or to bring these elements as close together as possible. This is both what holds politics and morality together and what distinguishes them from each other. This is what separates the task of the moral philosopher and the scholarly critic from the political actor. No political actor in American history understood this truth as well as Lincoln did. Now, Lincoln made three arguments against slavery: an argument from direct feeling, an argument from our faith, and an argument from reason. The argument from reason was true, but as such, ineffective. The argument from feeling was effective so far as it was true, that is, so far as the feeling that revulsion against slavery was felt. Reason ascertains truth, feeling prompts action. But the feeling against slavery for others is fragile. Lincoln knew perfectly well of many who held slaves without revulsion. Reasoning points to the truth of the anti-slavery position, but reasoning is ineffective without the support of feeling, and feeling is unreliable. It is too variable, too uncertain in itself. It needs to be formed, focused, and channeled. In this context, Lincoln's other argument against slavery comes into its own. The argument from our ancient faith, that is, from the American consensus on the Declaration of Independence. The fragility of both reason and feeling points to the need to cultivate fundamental moral and political truth in the mode of faith. Like the ancient faith of God's people, this is our ancient faith, our inheritance from our fathers. Lincoln preaches the universal and rational truth of freedom as the particularistic and non-rational inheritance of this people and its history. He attempts to attach the reverence reserved for the most sacred and venerable things to the fundamental truths of political life. The task for Lincoln's statesmanship, then, is to make the Declaration of Independence an object of an almost religious attachment. He took the truths of John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. Some of you have probably read some of those guys. He took the truths of these men, two men of the Enlightenment, who thought that rational argument plus self-interest would suffice to produce a decent and rightful political order. And he infused their truths with the spirit of religion and poetry. Now, it should be clear why Lincoln saw that he had to counter the apparently statesman-like accommodation that Douglas was attempting to sell to the nation. Douglas might perhaps gain some temporary political peace over it, in fact, but his policy would endanger the conditions for future political health, because it would further wean the nation away from its ancient faith, from its unreflected belief and feelings in favor of universal equality of rights and freedom. Worse than the existence of slavery itself, in other words, is the spreading of the view that slavery is a matter of indifference, that the nation could and should be neutral. So long as the moral evil of slavery is reaffirmed, so long as the ancient faith is kept alive, then, Lincoln claimed, one could rest secure in the belief that the evil would be abolished from the land in the course of time. He knew that this intransigence carried risks, but he knew the alternative was much worse. He knew also that the disparity between what is true and what is effectual meant that in any moment, the one who understands the relation between morality and politics and property must always settle for less than morality or abolitionists demanded. But he must always keep the moral principle alive, so that another statesman, another day, might aim at another and a more far-reaching conjunction between moral truth and politically efficacious feeling. I can do no better than to close out my thinking about Lincoln by quoting from his speech against the Supreme Court's decision from Dred Scott, in which he expresses his views of what the Declaration of Independence means. The framers of the Declaration of Independence defined with tolerable distinctness in what respects they did consider all men created equal, equal in certain inalienable rights. This they said, and this they meant. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all men were then enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for a free society, which could be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked up to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to people of all colors everywhere. For Lincoln, the statement, this is what made America great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We have time for questions. Well, we start with the students. I'm kind of impressed with one, but I'd rather hear from a student. Okay, I'll start with, okay. So
Yeah,
you're
Oh, they're up.
Okay, let's go back. Yeah.
If you were able to be a guest at Lincoln's home when he was alive and living in Springfield, Illinois, what kind of conversation would you want to have with him? What would you like to ask him?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, if you write a book on somebody, this is, in a way, the opportunity you have, although you have to construct his answers for him. So maybe that's an unfair kind of conversation. One of the issues that I was very taken by in my book, which maybe would have been one of the issues that I would have wanted to talk to him about, was how did he actually see the situation and his policies? How did he see those actually playing out historically in actual practice? Because I believe that when Lincoln, for example, I mean, let me give one example. So the House divided speech, which is a very important speech for Lincoln, it's a very controversial speech. And in that House divided speech, he says, you know, the country can't remain half slave, can't remain half free forever. And then he says, well, where are we moving? And he makes an argument that we are moving toward half slave. I'm sorry, all slave. We're moving towards all slave. But he says, he holds out the possibility we can still move towards all free. He lays out in some detail the tendencies in the country towards all slave. But he never lays out what are the forces that could make it all free. And so one of the questions that I push him on in my book is, what do you see to be those forces? And the answer is that, you know, there is no, he has no analysis really that gets us there. And I make the ultimate conjecture that what Lincoln sees, that he's got a policy that seems very moderate and tame, and that policy being to resist further expansion of slavery in the country, but that he actually understands the way opinion has been moving in the country, what the effect of that policy actually be. It seems a very moderate policy. It seems not a really extreme policy in the sense, doesn't attack slavery in the States or anything like that. But he sees that the result of that is going to be secession. He sees that it's going to be secession just to say no to expanding slavery. And I think he sees the result of secession to be war. And I think he sees, I don't know, I mean, I have a conjecture how he sees war working out to end slavery. Not the way it actually happened, but he had another agenda. But so I would have wanted to talk to him about that and ask him, is my conjecture about this what you actually have in mind? But he probably wouldn't tell me, you know. That's what I think I'd talk about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go to Steve.
Why exactly did some of the southern states take Lincoln's election as a declaration of war?
The southern states had come to believe, partly on the basis of the Dred Scott case, that they had a right to take their slaves into the territories and to expand slavery. And they had, well, not clearly a right, but they had a great desire to conquer new territory for slavery. So, for example, in the Democratic Party platform for the 1860 election, well, there were two Democratic parties running in 1860, as you may know, which is why Lincoln actually won the election was because of this. There was one Democratic Party that was the Southern Democratic Party, and then there was another one that was the Douglas Democratic Party. Douglas was the nominee for them. And both Democratic parties had as part of their platform, it's time to take Cuba. And the idea of taking Cuba was it would remain a slave territory. And then there was a great desire in the South to move into Central America, take Mexico, take who knows, how far they would go. So they saw on the one hand it was a rejection of their rights, and another right that they thought that they were being denied was they had a right to recapture fugitive slaves, and they didn't believe that the Northerners were not cooperating as they had a constitutional duty to do so, and so they felt that they were denied that. So the Republican Party, which was sponsoring these policies, they thought were just outright out to deny them their rights, and that their rights could only be fulfilled, their desire to expand, only if they left the Union. So that's what that was the main guts of what they had in mind. Some of them thought, I should mention one thing that was relevant. How relevant is the question? The John Brown raid, and John Brown has kind of history in this area, so you know what he was like. But so he had a raid in Virginia, in which he was attempting to rouse a slave rebellion, and the Republicans. There were some Republicans on the fringes who had something to do with John Brown, but mostly they did not. And Lincoln certainly denied any connection with John Brown. But the Southerners feared that this John Brown thing would be one of the, was part of the Republican agenda. Whether they really believed that or not, I'm not sure. But they at least thought this way. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned, actually part of this is, you mentioned in your last answer there, but you mentioned during your talk that Lincoln was a one-term congressman, and it was his only federal office before he became president. And that got me thinking that in large part that was his opposition to the war with Mexico. And then that reminded me that Douglas was a great champion of the American war with Mexico. In fact, I think he was part of the All Mexico movement to seize the entirety of Mexico in 1848 at the end of the war. And then that also got me to thinking that Douglas was a great champion of the filibuster movement throughout the 1850s, to expand slavery into Mexico and Central America, where he probably thought it would be natural for it to expand. And so I was curious, was part of Lincoln coming out of this semi-retirement in 1854 back into politics, not just Kansas, Nebraska, but also these southern attempts at empire in the Caribbean and Central America, and Douglas's championing of those attempts. I'm just curious as to what role, because we've talked about, I suppose, the role of the impact on Lincoln of the attempt to expand slavery in territories within the United States. But I'm just curious now, what role without the United States played?
This was of concern to Lincoln, very, very, very much. He never. It was not in his political actions. He didn't, like, for example, we didn't talk about that very much. But for one, he did have his most prominent speech in Congress in his one term was a speech against the Mexican War, in which he, in effect, accused President Polk of having started an unjust war, and suggesting that it was largely for the sake of expanding the territory for slavery. So that's the one place where it became fairly specific. But he did, he gave just after the Douglas debates, he gave two speeches which were not particularly political. They were different from almost everything else he did in his career. One of them was on the topic of discoveries and inventions, in which he talked about the human history of discoveries and inventions, and the other of which was about agriculture. I mean, he started the agriculture speech by saying, well, I don't understand why you're inviting me to give a talk to an agricultural fair. He never was much of a farmer, and never liked whatever farming work he had to do. But in both of those speeches, he goes out of his way to talk about the expansionist tendencies of America and to resist them and to try to find ways around them. So, for example, in the speech on agriculture, the speech on agriculture is devoted to something that he calls thorough cultivation. And he has a lot of statistics about the productivity per acre for wheat and corn and other crops. And he concludes, I'm not sure what basis he had for it, that the productivity could be doubled or tripled just with the land that we've got. And he talks then about the steam plow. He was very interested in the development of the steam plow, which could further this progress towards thorough cultivation. And he goes on, though, to make the connection that if you cultivate the land we've got thoroughly, there's no need to expand it. And so, the desire for expansion was partly the Southerners' desire for more land for slavery, but it was also partly white farmers who want more land for farming. And Lincoln is saying, no, we can get by with less land. So he does at least address, we see his concern, and we see that he has at least some kind of a solution to it, but it doesn't become part of his political platform, so to speak. But if it were if it was more actually happening, I think it would have been. Yeah, he does in the inventions and discovery speech, he has a kind of interlude in the middle of the speech on a movement that was called Young America, the Young America movement. The Young America movement was the movement that spawned the idea of manifest destiny. That is, it is the manifesto, clear destiny of America to spread all the way to the West Coast for one, but who knows how much farther. And this manifest destiny, or this Young America movement, was very, Douglas was a partisan of it, and they were partisan of Douglas. So, and he makes disparaging comments about the Young America movement in his speech. So that's one place where he is pretty explicit in opposing the expansionist elements in American political politics. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think if Lincoln had never re-entered politics, was America ready to abolish slavery? Would it have come at a similar time that it did, or do you think it would have come much later?
It's really hard to say. I mean, this is hypothetical history is
Right.
really hard to manage. So I mean, we can let's say somebody other than Lincoln had been president, but that the South seceded. So Buchanan was president at the moment that the South seceded, and his response was to say, secession is unconstitutional and illegal, but I don't have any power to deal with it. So his policy would have been, say goodbye. I mean, reluctantly, but we'd say goodbye. And there were many Republicans who actually took that position, and a very famous one, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of really the leading American newspaper, so far as it was a national newspaper. And really, when secession occurred, he said, "Let our erring sisters go, let them go." And not all Republicans felt that way, but some did. So that's one possible outcome, that the country would have split in half. The South would have gone its own way. We would have had probably adventures in South America or in Central America. And who knows what all else would have happened. So that's one trigger point that we can identify. Let's say that Lincoln had been assassinated in 1856 and not in 1865. And so who would have been the Republican, leader who would have had the role that Lincoln ended up having? That's hard to say too. The leading persons. If you've seen the Lincoln film, the Spielberg film, which I recommend to all of you if you haven't seen it, it's really quite a good film, and it captures a lot of the politics of the time. What Spielberg makes clear is that the Republican Party that Lincoln was presiding over was divided between a more radical wing and a more conservative wing. That's often happens. And it's hard to know which would have won. So the leading Republicans, probably the people at the most sort of prominence, was Seward of New York, and after him Chase of Ohio. They were not full-blown abolitionists, but they had leanings certainly in that direction. And if one of them had won the election, it's again hard to say. But here's an interesting fact. So Seward lost the nomination to Lincoln. The reason, and Lincoln was far more obscure than Seward. I mean, he was much, he was a hit from all along. Seward was from New York and the governor and the senator. I mean, he was really much more prominent. But Seward lost the nomination because it was feared he couldn't win the election. He couldn't win the general election. And it turned out Lincoln, it was thought, could win the general election because in the election of 1860, the key issue was winning the line of states, the second northern. So the North, if you look at a map of the U.S., there's two tiers of northern states, northern free states. There's the upper tier, Michigan, New York, New England. Then there's another tier, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. In 1856, the Republicans had won that northern tier, but had lost, except for Ohio, had lost this lower tier. But if they saw, it became apparent, if the Republicans could win that lower tier, they could win the presidency without one single vote in the South. So that became the Republican goal. And Lincoln, here's a fact not often known. Lincoln lost the election to Douglas, right, for the Senate, but he actually got more votes than Douglas got. Lincoln proved that he could win a state in that southern tier. And so Lincoln appeared to be a much more promising, because Lincoln was certain that Seward would not be able to win Illinois because he was too left-wing, too radical, et cetera, for that tier of states. And so, but here's the interesting thing: when Lincoln became president, he then appointed Seward as Secretary of State, the highest, that's the most prominent cabinet position that he had to give out. And Lincoln actually had a lot of regard for Seward. Seward was a very intelligent man on whose judgment he often relied. But 1 month after Lincoln's inaugural address, Seward sent him a note in which he said, the southern states are seceding, many of them being seceded, and the North has held on to Fort Sumter and one other fort, but not much else in this laws. And Seward is worried that Lincoln wants to hold on to Fort Sumter and in fact to restock it, it's running out of supplies. So Lincoln wants to restock it. And Seward is concerned that this is going to mean war because South Carolina is not going to tolerate this. I mean, it's interesting. If Fort Sumter had been in some other state, the whole Civil War history might have worked differently because South Carolinians were just crazier than other Americans. And so Seward could predict that the South Carolinians would leave and try to take Fort Sumter. So Seward had the following policy idea. One, we should abandon Fort Sumter. We should abandon Fort Sumter. Said first. Second, we should try to change the subject from slavery to patriotism, as he put it, to patriotism. And here's how we want to do it. We should declare war on France and Spain. And in that way, lure the South back into the Union for the sake of fighting this war with France and Spain. So when it came down to it, Seward didn't have the stomach for to face the Civil War. And Lincoln, the more moderate of the two, actually did. He had a stomach that was tough. But in this respect, Lincoln was willing to face the Civil War rather than to give in to the South on this issue. Whereas Seward, I think Seward's policy was, it's a sign of his, in a way, cowardice. Because the result, let's say it had worked. Let's say that the Southerners had come back into the Union and they beat Spain and France down in Mexico. What would the price be for the Southerners? It would be, Mexico or something like that. So that all that the Republicans had stood for, preventing the spread of slavery, would have to be given up in order to achieve his policy. And we'd be back where we started, or really on the track to all slavery. So, yeah, but I mean, you see things can be weird,
You said that Abraham Lincoln got pretty much re-involved in politics because he saw that the culture was headed to all slavery, and he wanted to shift it back towards anti-slavery and even eventually eradicate slavery.
Yeah.
In a similar way, can pro-lifers get involved in such a way that they can shift the culture's view to pro-life again and eventually ban abortion without leading to like widespread conflict or civil war?
I mean, I don't expect a civil war over abortion. I mean, partly the Civil War was possible because of the way the parties were geographically connected, or the South was a compact body, the North was a compact body, but now the whole abortion issue is like a little different. The opinion is more. So you'd have one coast, you have the other coast, and then you have me in Illinois. So the broader question can I mean there's one answer, which is the Supreme Court could swoop down and make another decision. I mean, there's a constitutional basis. The 14th Amendment says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And all the Supreme Court has to do is decree unborn children persons. And then they could say that the states must forbid abortion and must protect the lives of unborn children. So that's one way it could happen. Now, whether the court would have the nerve to do that is a question, and I make no predictions about that. I think if it were up to Thomas and Alito, they would, but I don't know if they could bring along the others. So that's, I can't. I mean, that's where do you have an idea? Do you have a thought on that?
No, not really. I mean, I agree. I don't think a civil war would happen because I don't think it's really possible for like widespread, I don't know. It almost seems like we're at a point that you couldn't change it without that also meaning there's going to be widespread rioting and uprisings and this and that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think if the Supreme Court did make such a decision, there would certainly be a lot of resistance to it, in a lot of protests anyway. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me as particularly interesting is, if you'll allow me to put it in a provocative fashion, the way that Lincoln seems to have disagreed with the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, that's okay.
Because it wasn't self-evident. It gave three arguments on the notions of equality. That seems to put a bit of distance between him and the founders. I was wondering why the self-evidence issue had disappeared? Was it that it really wasn't self-evident?
Well, the self-evident question, yeah, well, I've actually written about 5 articles on this topic, I'm not, I mean, my take on it is this. It says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, that's an odd way to say these truths are self-evident, because to say that we hold them, you don't hold something, you either see it or not to be self-evident. And so therefore, I think what Jefferson means to be saying in that formula is we Americans hold these truths as if self-evident, that is, as the starting points for our reasoning about politics. And I believe that Jefferson believed that there was a rational argument in support of those claims, but that politics doesn't, like he agreed with Lincoln on this. Politics doesn't work as a philosophy seminar. People have to understand things differently from the way philosophers might understand them. So Jefferson's beginning of that proposition that all men are created equal, et cetera, is one thing, but what the people live is another. And so I think in this regard, Lincoln and Jefferson were very close. That it had to be held, Jefferson as if self-evident, Lincoln as if a matter of faith. That's what they're saying. It's about not the epistemic status of those truths, but about the political status that those truths need to have in order to be effective. That's what I see. I don't know if that answers all problems, but
I wonder what the next follow-up just a little bit.
Yeah.
And that would be in the Gettysburg Address, I keep thinking to myself, who was his audience? Because it looks to me as though there's a good bit of talk about, say, Sarah, not mentioned by name, and Hagar, not mentioned by name. It looks like a theological argument in some ways.
in the Gettysburg Address. Now, why are you saying Sarah and Hagar? What?
Well, because one was born free and the other was born
Oh,
slave.
okay. And so how do you connect that to Gettysburg?
Well, it would seem that, I was just wondering about these, it would be an exploration of the main self-evident character. Would you be offering a theological argument or a quasi-theological argument to the generally Protestant population of
in which the generally Protestant population was completely divided on what the biblical message or the theological message about slavery was, right? And that's why we have Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists on this issue of similar things. Well, Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, I mean, he addressed the Gettysburg Address in a way I was talking about it. It's our fathers, and this is what they did, and the authority of our fathers is important in that speech. And we, in emancipating the slaves, are being true to our fathers and what they were dedicated to. Their dedication requires an extension from what they actually did. They didn't end slavery, but it's up to us to extend their commitment to all men are created equal and to end slavery. And this is his attempt, I think, to the Gettysburg Address, his attempt to defend the move towards this making the Civil War a war of liberation rather than a war about the Union. His earlier defense of the war was as a war with the Union, but now in Gettysburg it's a war for that all men are created equal and to make all men free, a new birth of freedom. So I think the Gettysburg Address remains within the orbit of what I was talking about today. The second inaugural moves beyond that, because in the second inaugural he tries to make the case that appeal to a higher authority than the fathers, in this case God. That is, the outcome of the Civil War indicates that God does not approve of slavery. Now, maybe he did in the past, but he doesn't now. And that authority, on the authority of God, we should accept the outcome of the Civil War as liberation. So that is an issue. That's certainly an issue for them. And
supplemental question, Dr. Ross.
Thank you. I want to return to dogs for a moment because it seems to me that what the Supreme Court did there was to go with Douglas. Okay.
In where?
In dogs, the dogs.
Oh, in Hopkins. Oh, okay, yeah,
To
yeah.
go with Douglas, and you know, as you said, he presents a fairly reasonable, you know, nuanced. So you know, I'm from Texas. We have a heartbeat law.
Yeah.
And a heartbeat law
Right,
in
yeah.
Kansas. So. Are we stuck there? Is it changed circumstances make the Douglas option much better now? Or is it simply the case that we're stuck with this? Are we going to let go of the principle, you know, the horror of slavery, and to go with popular sovereignty? So.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I'm going to say something maybe not popular in this crowd, but it seems to me that if the status of unborn children was as clear as the status of the slaves, the enslaved people, the issue would be more easily settled. In other words, there is genuine disagreement, whether justified or not, I'm not sure. But there's genuine disagreement. Does it make sense to think of unborn children as persons? I mean, you know, a person has something about it. So, that disagreement, we're not settling it very easily, I think. And if that were easily settleable, then we could probably find a solution to it. That would not be a Douglas-like solution. But I think you're right. I mean, what the Supreme Court has done is returned us to the Douglas-like decision. Each jurisdiction can settle the issue for itself. Yeah.
You said that there was the issue of the person. What about Justinian's institutes, where the provision was made that any child born of a woman who at any point was juridically free would be born free?
Yeah. And
it seems I want to just sort of explore that.
I think that supports the idea that fetus is just perfect.
Seems to.
Possible. Well, okay. I mean, I'm not denying that there's. I think there are arguments. I think there are arguments in favor of. I just want to say I don't think that to the public opinion is not clear on this subject. And maybe if they read Justinian, they would be clearer. But it's not very clear, and I think. Lincoln was right. People may have thought that the Africans were in some way inferior, but nobody thought they weren't human. So that.
All right, let's right there. Let's take our speaker. So please join us outside for the reception. It'll be around.